Hello and welcome all back to Election Time News America. Today is Wednesday, August 20th, 2025. We're looking at the Senate elections for 2026 and the uphill battle the Democrats are going to be facing and what the map looks like as of right now. Election Time News, your one-stop for all things elections and politics, from summations to poll reviews and news. Subscribe below for more content like this about American, Canadian, and Australian elections. We just went over the by-election in um, in Canada. That was in Battle River Crowfoot. So that's going to be one of the main events that's happening around Canadian politics. Australia, there's some state elections that are happening next year. We'll be getting into reviewing in a bit. Also, make sure to follow Substack, Threads, Instagram, and X to stay up to date on political news as it comes out. Remember, there's never a dull moment in politics. So to start things off here, we have obviously the blank Senate map. It's going to be a tough year, most likely, for the Republicans, as generally, in an average year for midterm, the party out of power gains seats. So that's going to end up being obviously the party out of power in the White House is the Democrats. They're likely going to gain seats. The Senate's a bit peculiar because of the staggered nature of the general when the seats go up. So sometimes there's incumbents that people don't like, or there are some that they do. And especially the past two times, 2018 and 2022, they were different than you might expect. They went the opposite direction from the House. But in general, they still do somewhat follow the rule. With the exception of 1982 and the two most recent ones, they do follow the rule that generally the party that's out of power in the White House does still lose Senate seats. That was absolutely true in 2014. We looked at the Democrats losing. Um, that's gonna be 9 Senate seats there. Um, 9 Senate seats lost in 2014. So that was a huge blow back then. But we're gonna be looking now at obviously 2026. What we're gonna be seeing here is gonna be the exact same map essentially as 2020, minus a race in Arizona and in Georgia, plus Ohio, plus Florida. So here's the map. It's going to be 34, 31 before any of these races are put out, and there are 35 races here, but there are 22 Republican seats up and only 13 Democratic seats, which means that generally this would be a good time for the Democrats to pick up seats. But if you highlight in all of the states that Donald Trump won this past cycle, then you can see where the problem comes in for the Democrats. And just like that, if they don't end up winning any split ticket seats, this is actually would be a flip. If they don't end up picking up any split ticket seats, this would actually be a flip, interestingly enough. Then obviously the Democrats are going to be in some trouble. So they're going to need to hold on in Georgia and in Michigan and hope to flip Maine, but we're going to be getting to that in a little bit. That's definitely still an uphill battle there for the Democrats. Starting things off with Donald Trump's approval rating, as it's always something interesting to watch. It did have a slight dip up a few days ago. There was a poll that had him at only minus 13, but then it started dropping down again. He's back down to minus 15, which is the lowest that he's had it since a while ago. Um, and so now looking down at the state by state, we can see in a lot of these competitive races, if we just check voters, then the only ones that are different than the states that went red or blue are the Biden Trump states and North Carolina. But if we go to all voters or all adults actually, then you end up with Ohio, Iowa, Florida. So those are a few that have races. You have Kansas, Texas, even he's underwater in Texas. Louisiana, Mississippi, even though these aren't competitive Senate races, he is still underwater with the majority of adults there. So it's very, very narrow in South Carolina, somewhat narrow down in South Dakota, Nebraska, even some very, very deep red states. But he is plus 46 in Idaho, so that's a relatively interesting. It actually gets closer. Um, it actually gets worse for him if you change the 2024 voters. It's only this situation in a few states, including Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maryland. But basically everywhere else, it gets more favorable to him in that scenario, 21, 23. So, okay. So, start things off, we have some polls here. We're going to be looking at the map. We have the overall result guesses. This is based off of all of this information here. Um, and so basically, we've compiled together the general result guesses from what we've seen before, incumbency status, ratings from multiple different sources, including generally the Cook Political Report here, and also looking at polls that have been already been done by RCP. This is generally a mixture of how things could go if things continue on the trend that they're at right now. Um, so there's somewhat guesses of what will happen exactly on 440 days from now, but it's not 100% certain how things will go, obviously, because things do change. So that's not entirely certain. But here we are here we're getting into the map. We're going to start off with the safe states. Basically, they're just not at all competitive. Starting things off with Alabama. It's going to be a safe state here. Tuberville is actually retiring, though. So this is a somewhat interesting one. Tuberville is retiring to run for governor. So he announced on May 27th he will run for governor. And so he was narrowly elected by Alabama standards, only by 20 points against an incumbent Jones, who won a runoff, a special election here. He won by 1.6 in 2017, a narrow flip. And so Democrats had a senator in Alabama for a short period of time, 3 years though. But then obviously he lost when it came around. Also, obviously, with Trump on the ticket. They did benefit from a lot of split ticket voting, but it's expected to be not that much stronger than the 2020 margin, just because there's no incumbency status on that. So there's going to be the first state. There's going to be Arkansas, where actually there was no a Democratic opposition in 2020. He won by 33 points. Not expected to be competitive by any means. Next, we're going to go to Delaware, which is going to be safe for the Democrats. 22 points for Coons. This is another strong blue state, 21.5 in 2020. Basically, all these are going to be slightly increased because 2020 wasn't a very strong blue year for the Senate. We also have Idaho, and then just going through Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia are going to be the very safe red states. And then also for the Democrats, for the safe states there, we have Rhode Island, Massachusetts. And just to keep things a bit interesting, those are the relatively consistent ones that are always a bit less interesting, but also safe in that column is going to be New Jersey by almost 20 points. Cory Booker's seat right there, he won by 16 in 2020. He's expected to improve that margin. And then we have in Rhode Island a very strong overperformer in Reed. He wins by a lot more than expected every single time. In Illinois, Dick Durbin's retiring, but that's still a very, very blue seat, so expected to be relatively strong for no matter who ends up winning the nomination there, 13.4% for the number there. So basically, that's the map for the safe states. Next, we're going to continue adding a few more. Virginia. Mark Warner won by 12.1% in 2020, 14.9, just under a 15-point margin coming up this cycle potentially. Next is going to be the two twins, you should call them down here. Louisiana is going to be actually the only one that's safe, interestingly enough. They got rid of the jungle primary system, 28.7 points for Cassidy. There's jungle primary system here, but he got over 50% of the vote, which means that he won outright. But if you look at the other general elections are quite a bit messy. Then you have the two leaders, and they end up having a runoff afterwards. So then he ends up winning by 21, for example. But and all of that. He ended up winning by 40 points. Expected to be a bit less than that, as there's already going to be consolidated support behind one candidate. There's going to be higher turnout, which means that Democrats will likely be able to show out more. Mississippi's interesting because it's a relatively weak candidate. Still 9.4%, not concerningly close or anything. Just a bit sad here. 9.98 points in 2020 for Hyde Smith. Not a relatively liked candidate. Not by any means concerningly close. Again, as I said, just over 9 points, but still a much closer margin than you might expect for a state like Mississippi. Kansas is going to be another, actually a very narrow, likely state, probably around the margin that we saw Mississippi go in 2020. Marshall only won by 11.4 in 2020. If we end up getting a relatively strong Democratic candidate in there, it could definitely end up actually tightening even more. It's going to go red by the end of the night, but it could be somewhat interesting to see that race play out. In South Carolina, we actually have an improving margin from Graham's 10.3 points in 2020. Harrison was an extremely strong fundraiser, so that definitely helped him because he was able to spend a lot on advertising and such. 13.8 points here. It's actually going to be an increase, one of the few where you can expect an increased margin for the Republican in the race here. Then we go to Oregon, where we have a 19.9 point margin. We have Merkley here, 17.6 points in 2020. Another relatively, actually a relatively plain race as far as things go there. And I'm pretty sure Colorado barely with 11.8 points. Hickenlooper, DC the incumbent. That's why it was relatively low in 2020. But now he's expected to do relatively well there. Probably going to actually do a bit better than that. Just have to see some polling there and just wait and see how things go. So that's going to be the main safe map. There's going to be a few interesting races that are going to be a bit more competitive than might have been expected because there's a lot of strong recruiters, generally on the liberal side, being the Democrats plus the candidate in Nebraska, we'll get to in a minute, but also just relatively competitive states in general. So now let's go in alphabetical order. Alaska, 7.9%. It's actually going to be a bit lower if Mary Peltola does end up jumping into the race here. Chuck Schumer was trying to convince her to do that. She was originally most likely going to go for governor. This is somewhat difficult of a race for her, most likely. Dan Sullivan isn't unpopular. He did only win by 12.5 on the exact same ballot that Trump won Alaska by only 10.1, which means that he did overperform slightly by 2 points. But that's still not an extremely strong state for a Democrat. Mary Peltola did win the statewide House election, though, so she's a strong candidate in her own right. It's just not going to be as strong of a race for any Democrat to really be able to have much of a shot to win in. Next, we're going to go down to Georgia, where we do have a race for Ossoff by 1.9%. Very, very narrowly under lean there. Ossoff was beating Collins by 1 point in the most recent poll here, shown on RCP only, though, by tip done in early August. And so that's generally going to be probably one of the most competitive races is going to be in Georgia. Going to be watching that along with North Carolina and now Ohio as well, depending on how things go, and potentially even Iowa. Next is going to be, speaking of Iowa, 3.9%. This is going to be a relatively close race with the entrance of Rob Sand. He's the only Democrat who has won a statewide election in Iowa in the 2020s. So that's going to definitely tighten things up. He did win, I believe it was auditor, for the state of Iowa by a few thousand votes I'm pretty sure it was actually 2020. So that's definitely going to be a relatively tight race there, whether they end up doing well or not. Joni Ernst isn't necessarily very popular either. She only won by 6.5 in 2020. So this race could potentially tighten up even more as things continue on. Maine, 3.7 points. This is quite a bit of a drop for Susan Collins. She has been in the Senate for a very long time, going all the way back to, let's see here, all the way back to, pretty sure it's actually somewhat more recent than that, Susan Collins in 1996. So she has been through the entire 21st century so far, and she is now expected to win another term in the Senate. So that's going to be a crucial hold for the Republican Party, um, getting their way to 50 seats and hurting the Democrats on the road to 51 because of J.D. Vance's tie-breaking vote. It's relatively close. There was another candidate who announced that he's likely going to join the race. He yesterday did his announcement on on X there. So that's generally going to be the interesting race to watch. Definitely going to be very competitive, but we did also see in 2020 she was expected to lose to Sarah Gideon by 7 points, and she ended up winning by 8.5 on the same ballot that Joe Biden won the state by 9. So 17 points of split ticket voting is definitely going to potentially come to her aid again. As of right now, it looks like she is going to hold on. In Michigan, things are very interesting. This is a very narrow hold as well, even closer than Georgia, interestingly enough. Just because of how this field is coming out, it's going to be very, very close. Rogers versus Stevens. Stevens is only ahead by 1. Mike Rogers was the candidate in 2024 that definitely gave Slotkin a tough battle. She only won by a third of a point, 19,000 votes. So that's going to be a relatively strong candidate there. The war rating actually is a bit blue, but that is mostly strength of Slotkin instead of weakness of Rogers. He's a relatively strong candidate. And so that will definitely end up being a relatively competitive race all cycle long. That's going to be a race that Democrats urgently need to hold on to. And if the Republicans can pick it up, then it would be basically a disaster for the Democrats. Minnesota, 5.8 points. This is after Tina Smith's retiring. She won by 5.2 in 2020. It's an open seat, depends on who ends up getting the nomination here. It's relatively open as far as things go right now. We have Penny Flanagan and Angie Craig going up against each other, Lieutenant Governor versus U.S. Representative for the 2nd Congressional District. And so that's really going to end up changing the race up. We have likely and lean for two predictors each. So we're going to have to wait and see how things go as polling starts until then. Nebraska is now lean Republican. Dan Osborne did jump into the race not that long ago. He's an independent. He did pretty well in 2024. In a red wave year, he was able to get the margin down to 6 2/3 points in the race against Deb Fisher. And Pete Ricketts actually isn't even officially a full-term incumbent yet. He does have the incumbency status by itself, but he still is relatively new to the Senate, so that's going to end up making things a bit more difficult for him. Plus, Dan Osborne entirely has name recognition as he just ran last year, and he's not an actual Democrat, so he's able to appeal to independents and moderate Republicans as well. New Hampshire, 4.8 points, just under the likely margin there. We have Jeanne Shaheen retiring, which is a huge blow for Democrats. 15.5 points in 2020 compared to on the same ballot was only a 7.5 point margin for Joe Biden. So she's a huge overperformer. As you can see here, the war rating was 8.7, and she performed almost 14 points better than expected for the state of New Hampshire. So that's going to be a huge blow there. But still, Chris Papas, the House candidate for New Hampshire's 1st congressional district, has jumped into the race. He won by 8.1 in 2024, and he's slightly stronger than Maggie Goodlander, who is going to stay there. That does kind of leave the seat a bit vulnerable, but most likely it's going to be a blue year, so it's not going to be that competitive either way. But he is going to potentially end up winning. The Republicans have gotten together with, wow, I was thinking of Massachusetts because it was the former Massachusetts senator that they recruited here in New Hampshire. Scott Brown, he won the race in Massachusetts. You can see off-cycle elections. There was an off-cycle election that took place in 2010. Right here, Scott Brown won by almost 5 points. So that's going to be a relatively strong recruit for the Republicans, as he was even able to win in such a red state as Massachusetts, but still he does have the lower name recognition, et cetera, of that Chris Pappas is not. He already has the half of the state, so that's definitely going to be a bit difficult for Republicans. But if they're able to pick up New Hampshire, then that basically spells a bloodbath for the Democrats, as much as they'd also have Michigan and Georgia. New Mexico is going to be likely. Lujan isn't necessarily a strong candidate. Did overperform by a narrow amount, 1.17. The war rating is actually 2.7, though, so it's not necessarily for a strong Republican either. On Chetty wasn't a hugely impressive candidate by any means. But it is New Mexico, so you could expect probably about an 8-point margin as of right now. Some polls would be good to get in more into the cycle, but we'll have to see from there. North Carolina, this is a flip for the Democrats, 1.2%. It's actually gotten narrower recently as we've seen these numbers start to come in closer, and also Cooper has the better name recognition. So once we get more from the actual more name recognition, more campaigning from Whatley, most likely this number is going to get closer, and the margin, the spread is going to get smaller. So that's going to be something concerning for the Cooper campaign here, but he is definitely a top tier pick. He was a popular Democratic governor in the state of North Carolina, so that's going to definitely help them. But this is definitely the best pickup opportunity the Democrats have. And when we look at the cycle at the end of 2026, when we look at the Senate results, basically North Carolina is going to be what we're going to be looking at, or potentially Georgia. North Carolina and Georgia are going to be the main two. Next, we're going to be looking down at the state of Texas. 4.5 points now, brought down a bit because there seems to be more going on in the primaries between John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. But we also have Colin Allred. He definitely did relatively well in 2024, even though he lost by 8.5 to Ted Cruz. He did still overperform expectations. Also, the current candidate actually underperformed expectations as well in Texas. That is John Cornyn. Did underperform a bit from the environment and expected margins, and also Paxton is a relatively polarizing figure. So things don't look that strong for Republicans this year, and Democrats are looking relatively strong, but we're looking at the exact same thing we saw in 2018, and then Beto O'Rourke lost by 2.6 points to Ted Cruz. So wouldn't be surprised here. There seems to be some sort of impassable slope eventually that's hit for Democrats in the state of Texas, which then means that Republicans have 50 seats, which means that they will retain their Senate majority, even if the Democrats win both of these seats, which is not happening. Based on the current numbers, looking at the two special elections in Ohio, we have 1.8 point margin, very, very narrow. But a narrow victory nonetheless for the Republicans. Why has this tightened up so much recently? Is because Sherrod Brown has officially announced that he is entering the race. He only narrowly lost to Bernie Moreno in 2024 by a pretty narrow margin. He outran Kamala Harris by quite a bit, and he actually did do a very strong job there in the state of Ohio. He's been a senator for a long time. He already comes with name recognition. Now, so does the Republican candidate as well, because he is the then Lieutenant Governor John Husted. He was the Lieutenant Governor of Ohio, so he also did win 2 elections on the same ticket as Mike DeWine, so he does have his own name recognition in his own right. But this is definitely going to be a relatively tight race, and it's one that Republicans are definitely going to have to now spend money on in order to be able to not lose it, because Brown is a relatively well-liked, seen as moderate senator that is going to definitely help chances for the Democrats. And then finally in Florida, we have 5.8 point margin. This is just a relatively strong state for the Republicans. This is going to be a relatively easy hold. It could generally go anywhere from probably about 4 points all the way up to about 16. It just entirely depends on who ends up running where. There's no real front runners. The last poll for the primaries that's shown on RCP here at least was way back going way back to election day. Interestingly, no, actually, it must have been something sooner than that. I remember one where it was that was governor. So there's no real leaders here right now. We're looking at Ashley Moody. Ashley Moody is the unelected incumbent here. She's relatively strong. She's run alongside Ron DeSantis both times, and actually, I think she outperformed him by a very slight amount um, in 2022, even considering his own very impressive margin of 19 and a half points in 2022. A huge win for the Republicans there, especially considering that in 2018 he'd only won by just over a third of a point. So that's going to definitely impact things there. She's a very strong performer. She knows the state. She has name recognition. For the Democrats, they do have a pick in Josh Whale. So he announced his candidacy, and so that's actually, uh, but he apparently did withdraw his candidacy. That's going to be a large drawback. That's actually relatively new news there. Oof. But the former congressman from the Ninth Congressional District is running, Alexander Vindman, and so that's not as large of a field. Josh Whale would have definitely been a very strong candidate, but he did withdraw recently due to health concerns. So that is going to end up definitely making the race a bit worse. Whale did relatively well in the special election in Florida just on April 1st. So that would have been a very strong pick. But instead, now it's basically just for Ashley Moody to be able to beat most likely is going to be Grayson at this point in time, as he has the best name recognition, unless maybe Vindman can end up pulling together a win. But either way, most likely the Republicans are going to be able to hold on to that seat, as it is a very right trending, continually right trending, and Republican state, meaning that the final map is going to be 52 to 48, with a much tighter race now in Ohio, slightly closer race in Alaska, Texas continuing to get closer, Maine, and a continually interesting race in Nebraska. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Comment down below what sort of content you want to see more of, and have a fantastic rest of your day.